Everyone. Thank you for tuning into this interview. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Hannah Appel, who I am very fortunate to have here. She is one of the co-founders of the Debt Collective, which is a membership-based union for debtors and their allies, aiming to transform the economic system that forces individuals into debt for basic needs like education, healthcare, and housing. By uniting debtors, the organization seeks to leverage collective power to cancel debts and advocate for publicly funded essential services. Dr. Hannah Appel is an associate professor at UCLA teaching global studies, international development studies, and anthropology. She also serves as the associate director of the UCLA Luskin Institute on Inequality and Democracy. And then beyond academia, Appel is a co-founder, as we said earlier, with the Debt Collective, contributed to its mission of building a debtors union to challenge and change the current economic system. Thank you so much for joining me too, Dr. Appel. I really appreciate it. If you want to just give like a quick intro to yourself outside of that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. Yeah, my name is Hannah. I use she, her pronouns. I was born and raised in San Francisco, and I came to organizing and started my work with the Debt Collective, mostly in Occupy Wall Street. So starting in about 2011, and the Debt Collective did emerge out of Occupy Wall Street. My PhD is in anthropology, and I was focused on economic anthropology and the anthropology of capitalism in particular. So Occupy Wall Street came around at a time when I was just finishing my PhD and coincidentally moved to New York for a postdoc. So I was really lucky in some ways to be there at that time. Yeah, and the people with whom I co-founded the Debt Collective are people I met during Occupy Wall Street and have continued to organize with in an ongoing basis to this day. And I will say, because it's relevant, just my little part of my family, so like me and my husband and our two kids, not to mention any of our siblings, but just us, have about $65,000 in student debt, and other kinds of debt too. So, I'm both an organizer and a debtor, which is often how we structure things at the Debt Collective. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, so I think you kind of went over it already with that story with Occupy Wall Street, but I was just kind of interested in like what were some other motivating factors in co-founding the collective and kind of also how you were able to organize it with your co-founders as well.
Yeah. So, Occupy Wall Street, probably for a lot of folks who are listening to this, or even for you, feels like a long time ago. And for folks who don't know, the Occupy movement emerged out of a lot of things, and it's part of a much longer kind of anti-capitalist organizing history, obviously. But immediately before Occupy Wall Street formed in 2011 was the what's called the Great Financial Crisis, the GFC. And most people know, between about 2008 and 2010. Millions of people lost their homes, lost their homes for which they were indebted to banks, right? Because people buy homes mostly through mortgages. And the great financial crisis, the GFC, precipitated by the mortgage crisis, was the greatest wealth loss event for Black and Latinx families in that century. It was also, student debt was too insignificant to measure statistically, even at the turn of the 21st of the millennium. But by 2011, a lot of folks participating in Occupy Wall Street had a lot of student debt that they couldn't pay. So you're already looking at mortgage debt, you're already looking at student debt. People were thinking about the medical care system, the healthcare system, and how they were getting sick and unable to pay for it, especially if they had to pay rent that they couldn't afford or had student debt that they couldn't afford. Many people had tried to graduate from college, noticed that they had medical insurance while they were in college, but then they left college and they didn't have it. And if you don't have insurance, often you can't afford to get medical care, right? So during Occupy Wall Street, we started noticing the kind of centrality of household debt, and a group called Strike Debt emerged from Occupy Wall Street around it that did a bunch of stuff, including probably most famously the Rolling Jubilee, which I'm happy to talk about. But there was a group of us within Strike Debt. I eventually moved home to the Bay Area, which is where I'm from. I started Strike Debt Bay Area, but kept in touch with organizers who were out in New York. And there was a group of us who were really interested in this idea of debtors unions, which is to say, debt, when we experience it alone, it's isolating, it's frightening. Often we can't pay it. We're told it's our individual faults. But we also realized that debtors organized collectively could have potential power. And that's not exactly what Strike Debt was doing. That's not exactly what the Rolling Jubilee was doing, but there was a group of us that wanted to start doing that. Some of us in New York and some of us in Oakland. And so the way we got started actually was by organizing with a group of folks who had graduated from or left, had debt to Corinthian colleges, which was then the largest for-profit college chain in the country. And they had already started to organize, but they were going after some tactics and strategies that weren't working for them. And so we started talking about a debt strike with them. And that was back in 2014. So like 11 years ago, right here in Ontario, actually, they were based here in Southern California.
That's awesome. Yeah. I think another thing that I kind of thought of when you were going through the story is just kind of if you could talk about how you've connected your your anthropology work and your work through academia with the debt collective and like kind of that intersection between the two.
Absolutely. So back then in 2011, I had just finished my dissertation, right? So I was a newly minted graduate student. I had a postdoc, which is like a great job after that you can get right after your PhD, which is where you don't necessarily have to start teaching yet. You can kind of keep writing, maybe get some publications out. I had a postdoc at Columbia, again, kind of coincidentally, right when Occupy Wall Street started. And David Graeber, who's a very well-known, may he rest in power, now passed on economic anthropologist and kind of well-known anti-capitalist activist. I was hanging out with him and some other economic anthropologists who live in New York or did at the time. Shout out to Yarimar Bonilla and Michael Ralph and David Graeber. We were all together, and David was telling us about Occupy Wall Street. So it was really through a network of economic anthropologists in New York that I even found it. This was way at the beginning, before anybody knew, before protesters had been kettled on the Brooklyn Bridge, before, and this was just like when cool out there folks like David Graeber were meeting on Wall Street every day. So, David was telling us about it, and I just checked it out the next day. And it's really interesting. One of the ways that I tell this story is that, I had just gotten a PhD. I thought I was kind of a badass. I had written a dissertation on capitalism. I had talked a lot about Marx in my seminars. I thought, I don't know, I mean, I'm making fun of myself now, but looking back, I really thought I knew a thing or two about a thing or two. And then I showed up at Occupy Wall Street and I realized that even though I had just spent 7 years thinking critically about capitalism, I didn't know shit. I didn't know about, or I should say, I think I was taught explicitly and implicitly that my critical knowledge would somehow dismantle it. And that's not what's going to dismantle it, right? What's going to dismantle it is people building power together and flexing that power in these extraordinarily complicated and imperfect ways. And that is my re-education that really started in 2011, a complete re-education that I got on the terrain of social movements and not in the terrain of the university.
Yeah, I think yeah, I mean, I feel like a lot of people can kind of resonate with those feelings. I think as you grow older, is that at, this stage in, people who are like my age, but college age students think they know everything, think they got a grip on the world, and in reality, so much more to know and learn. So yeah, I mean, it
Yeah.
makes total sense. I think another question I'd like to ask, kind of related to the debt collective and kind of, the progress that you've made between 2011 and now. If you could just share what you think your strongest, most notable goal that you guys have made in the collective, or
Mhm.
just any important policy changes that you favor over others.
Oh my gosh. I mean, we've gotten hundreds of billions of dollars in debt abolished. Hundreds of billions of dollars. The vast majority of it has been student debt held by folks who attended for-profit colleges. Those folks who attended for-profit colleges, for a lot of reasons that we can talk about, are disproportionately Black women. Black women disproportionately hold student debt in general, whether they attended a for-profit college or not. But for-profit colleges are kind of classic examples of what's called a like predatory inclusion institution, right? So yeah, we've gotten hundreds of billions of dollars of student debt abolished. We put student debt on the map. When we started we were laughed at. The press laughed at us. They were like, ha ha ha, these people want student debt abolished. And while they're at it, they think college should be free. The media has a very short memory, but of course, public college, like the one you and I are at, was free as long as it was like mostly white dudes who went to it, right? And it was really only when Reagan takes over as the president, sorry, first as the governor of California and eventually as the president, that you see nominally public schools start to charge tuition. This is not coincidentally at the time when Black and brown students are demanding into these institutions. And so, precisely the families that have been excluded or at the bottom of the racial capitalist hierarchy in the United States are finally kind of fight for access and win access to public institutions just at the moment, again, not coincidentally, when folks like Reagan privatize them and they say, oh, yeah, you want in? Well, then you're going to have to pay, right? And so
Mm.
families don't have that kind of intergenerational wealth. And so they go into debt to offer their children a chance at an education that, of course, white folks have had intergenerationally for a much longer time. Certainly middle class and upper class white folks, not necessarily working or poor white folks. So yeah, I mean, I think some of our biggest wins have been those hundreds of billions of dollars of debt abolition, putting student debt on the map as a political issue. We took it all the way to the Supreme Court. What was that? That was the summer of 2023. And if you look at a graph of student debt, you see it starting from about zero, statistically negligible at the turn of the millennium, right? 2000, it goes up and up and up and up and up and up and up. And it peaked at about $1.8 trillion, which means that it is the second highest debt load of American households after mortgages. It also means, by the way, that the Department of Education is the largest bank in the country because that $1.8 trillion is largely owed to the Department of Education. But once you see our work really start to take root, you actually see that graph starting to come down. So, and one of the things that I want to note, you said, oh, well, what about policy changes? And I want to be really clear for folks who are listening to this and folks who are interested in social movements. Policy change is important, but it is not the only goal, and in my opinion, should not be the primary goal of social movements that want to build countervailing power, right? We didn't start the Debt Collective and say, our policy goal is to, right? We said we are going to build the collective power of debtors to refuse to pay unjust debts. And those folks in policy circles can figure out what to do with us. We will build so much power that they will have to respond to our
Mm.
call. Abolish student debt. That wasn't a policy proposal. That was kind of a radical demand, right? They ended up translating it into deeply imperfect policy outcomes, as they often do. But when I say they, who do I mean? We got our first couple hundreds of millions of dollars of debt abolition under the Obama administration. Then comes the first Trump administration. And because we had built so much power, it didn't matter who was in office. Trump's first Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, we won many more hundreds of millions of dollars of debt abolition under the first Trump regime, under Betsy DeVos, and she signed every debt abolition notice with extreme displeasure, comma, Betsy DeVos, right? And then we continued to win under the Biden administration when we took it all the way to the Supreme Court. So we're probably best known for our work in student debt, but we've also abolished a bunch of medical debt. We've abolished a bunch of carceral debt. We have some really exciting work in housing, which you can check out under the Tenant Power Toolkit. If you go to tenantpowertoolkit.org, we made a piece of online legal mutual aid where any tenant in California, using any one of California's 5 most spoken languages, can file a legal defense to eviction on their phone. So, we've done all kinds of stuff and we are just getting started.
Yeah, I think that perfectly segues into the question I wanted to ask after, which was kind of just not only your future goals with Debt Collective, but more so how the collective plans on expanding your guys' membership and network and whatnot for the years to come.
Yeah.
Because most likely, I assume you guys predict there will be even more people that have more debt as people get older and go to college and buy houses and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, the next this Trump administration, it's not really that people are getting older and going to college and buying houses. It's that as the government increasingly privatizes what should be public services, which is to say, People are trying to access medical care. People are trying to rent an apartment. People are trying to get an auto loan, right? As so many pieces of what could be a public safety net, right? Public schools. I mean, I would say there's a lot that's in danger right now. As more and more of those things become privatized, which is certainly what the this current Trump administration wants to do, people will go deeper and deeper into debt for their basic needs in life. I'm not even talking about a mortgage here. I'm talking about being able to go to the doctor. I'm talking about being able to rent an apartment. I'm talking about being able to even go to a public K through 12 school, let alone a college, right? So we're really anticipating an uptick of household debt under the Trump administration, this current Trump administration. But I will also say, COVID-19, the pandemic brought household debt really into the foreground because people lost their jobs. And suddenly, the media, the chattering class out there was like, oh my gosh, people can't pay their bills, right? Because people don't have savings, right? People's rent is too damn high. Their medical bills are too expensive, whether it's their grocery bills are super expensive. And so people lost their jobs. And what did you see immediately? There was a moratorium on student debt payments. There was an eviction moratorium in California. There were utility bill moratoriums. So all of these monthly bills that debtors have to pay every month. Suddenly during COVID-19, A, people couldn't pay them, but B, government stepped in and said, we can pause these debts. And not only can we pause these debts, we can even send you a basic income check, right? We can send you a stimulus check. So COVID-19 sent tens of thousands of people into our work, just as it did the LA Tenants Union, right? Because suddenly people realized how precariously housed they were. And if they lost their jobs, they realized they could lose their apartments right away. But during a pandemic, that was more dangerous than being unhoused even is on a day-to-day basis. So the last couple years, certainly starting from the pandemic, have been extraordinarily busy for us, with, thousands and thousands of more members joining all the time. And I think, again, at the beginning of this second Trump administration, people are understandably frightened for all kinds of different reasons, rightly so. We're running right now something called the 100 Days to Build Debtor Power, which I know you attended, which is rad. So, we really try in moments like this to help people find ways to plug into social movements because the truth of the matter is we were fighting tooth and nail under Biden. We are fighting tooth and nail under Trump, and we would have been fighting tooth and nail under a Kamala Harris administration as well. It's not to say that that wouldn't have been different. It would have been different. I don't want to say that a Trump regime and a Harris regime would have been the same. They're not, but we would have still been fighting hard had the Democrats won the presidency. And I guess the final thing I'll say in response to a question about, what does the future hold or how are we growing our membership? Here is my deepest desire for our work. A lot of folks out there know what a workers' union is, right? They know what a labor union is. They know that if they organize together with the other folks who work in their Starbucks or at their university or at their auto plant, they have a lot more power to collectively bargain over not only their wages, but also their benefits. And in what's called a bargaining for common good model, right, labor unions can make broader demands even outside of the contracts at work. One worker walks off the job, the boss is like, whatever, fuck it, you're fired, right? But all of those workers in a union walk off the job. Then suddenly the boss realizes that his profits actually come from worker labor power, right? That's classic Marx, but that's also what labor unions are based on. Lots of folks know what workers' unions are. And thankfully, in your generation, I feel like people are waking back up to them and getting excited about them and seeing in places like Amazon and Starbucks, where so many folks are having jobs, that it's really important to unionize to get better pay, better benefits, et cetera. Many, many fewer people know what a tenants union is, and fewer people still know what a debtors union is. But they work in similar ways, right? Just like one worker who walks off the job and says, I want higher pay. The boss is like, whatever, too bad, see you later, right? So too, one tenant says, I'm not going to pay my rent because I have a hole in my ceiling. The landlord will be like, great, I will evict you, right? But if all of the tenants in that landlord's building say, none of us are going to pay our rent until you fix the conditions in our building, then they have financial power over that landlord, right? Suddenly that power calculus flips. And it's the same thing with debtors, right? So debtors, whether you owe a utility company, whether you owe the federal government with your student loan debt, whether you owe a specific medical insurer with a thinking about United Healthcare, right? The recent Luigi Mangione situation. Debtors isolated, if I say, oh, I'm not going to pay my utility bill this month, guess what? My electricity gets turned off, right? But if everybody who owes to that same utility company says the rates are too damn high, we are not going to pay until, right? If they threaten a debt strike, then suddenly what was an individually isolating and frightening debt becomes a source of power to change the world around us. So my goal for the future of the debt collective is that, and frankly, it's for the future of social movements in general, is that everybody, we have what we could call wall-to-wall unionism. You can have a union at work, you can have a union at home, whether you are a tenant or a mortgage holder, and you can have a union across all of your debt contracts. Because then working class people, poor people, middle class people could actually have a tremendous amount of power over banks, over landlords, over the government, over oil companies, over all of the things we actually need to have power over to remake the world in the way we want to see it, which is a world in which everybody would be housed, everybody would be fed, everybody would have a wonderful education if they wanted it, but not have to have a higher education if they didn't want it. Everybody would have access to medical care, right? A world of abolitionist presence, which is to say, everything for everyone. And we have to build material power to get there. So that's what we're doing.
Right. And I think what you said about, the privatization of essential needs is, especially an alarming and pressing issue. I think what that made me think of is that I just wanted to ask if you guys are collaborating or plan on collaborating with any other social movements or organizations that also care, specifically about the privatization of healthcare, privatization of, other public sectors.
Oh yeah, all the time. So in the housing work, which I'm super involved in, we collaborate really closely with the LA Tenants Union, right? And the goal there is that housing is taken off the speculative market and that housing is de-commodified. Imagine that. That's a hard world to imagine, but imagine that housing not only is no longer a kind of speculative financial asset for real estate investors, but that housing is taken off the commodities market and is made into a public good, right? We know about public housing, but public housing is often a kind of space of hyper policing and anti-blackness and extraordinary violence, right? So reimagining what a lot of people now are calling social housing, moving away from public housing into social housing. So in that space, we collaborate with tons of people. We collaborate with the LA Tenants Union. We collaborate with the Autonomous Tenants Union Network. We collaborate with the Tenant Union Federation, which is like a big national group of tenants unions. In the medical debt space, we collaborate with we collaborate with the National Nurses Union in their big fight for Medicare for all, right? Which is something that we're really going for. We have a bunch of kind of hospital specific stuff in Baltimore, Philadelphia. So we collaborate with some groups on the ground there around our medical debt stuff. In our student debt stuff, we've collaborated with all kinds of folks. Project on Predatory Student Lending. We've done a bunch of work with Dream Defenders. We've done a bunch of work with Harriet's Wildest Dreams. So we collaborate with different folks all the time, depending on where we are, depending on what the issue is. Yeah, and we will continue to do that, of course.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think the kind of the segue I would like to take now is kind of talk about, as participants in social movements and social organizers like you are yourself, just kind of interested in how you're able to balance, being an organizer, but also, having a job and having a family and, just
Yeah.
being a complete human being and having responsibilities and whatnot. Just kind of if you could detail how you deal with it.
Yeah. I think the first thing I'll say is that it's hard. Um, I often feel like I have two full-time jobs, though my work with the Debt Collective is not paid, right? My UCLA
Mhm.
professor job is the job that pays me, and it's the job where I get benefits. But I do a lot of work for the Debt Collective. And what I realized, especially during COVID, My first book, my first sole authored book that I wrote was about US oil companies in Central Africa, right? I said I'm an anthropologist of capitalism. Transnational oil industry is one of the kind of biggest and most pressing capitalist geopolitical interest industries on our planet. I wanted to write about it. I wanted to think about it. So my first book was on oil, U.S. oil companies in Central Africa. And so for a while, I had kind of two. I had like my research work, and I had my activist work, and they were kind of like parallel tracks. But especially because during COVID, I couldn't use the research funds that I had won to go do this other project on African banking. I was going to go to Morocco and I was going to go to Nigeria and I was going to go to Mauritius and I was going to go to Ghana. We went to Ghana as a family right before the pandemic hit. Right after the pandemic, we were able to go to Mauritius, but I lost some research years in there because I couldn't travel. But as I said, at the same time, that was the moment, the pandemic was a moment when thousands and thousands of people were learning about the debt collective work and wanting to join this debtors union, wanting to find out what it was about. So our work really intensified at that time. That was also around the time where I had just taken this job as the associate faculty director at the UCLA Luskin Institute on Inequality and Democracy, where we partner with social movements. It's what the institute does. And I think our director, I'm one of the associate directors, but our faculty director, Ananya Roy, has been very clear in her vision for that institute that we partner with, learn from, grow with social movements. And frankly, I think she brought me on as an associate director because I was so involved in a social movement, right? So having that position in that institute has really helped me see that my work with the debt collective, while it is primarily organizing work, I didn't come to it as a researcher. It is an extraordinarily important kind of knowledge production. And here I will channel my best Robin D.G. Kelly, who I'm sure Professor Turner has taught you guys about, right? Who says that social movements produce new knowledge and social
Hmm.
movements produce new questions. And I, by virtue of my, 12-year experience on the ground with the debt collective from the very beginning, by virtue of that experience, plus my location in a university, have this extraordinary positioning to be able to say, okay, this social movement is producing new knowledge. I have this position at this institute over here where I can write about it. I can get grants that both fund research, fund me, fund PhD students to analyze data, and also where we can use those grants to partner with the LA Tenants Union. We can use those grants to partner with the Debt Collective because that's what this institute is about, right? To listen to those questions that, as Professor Kelly says, social movements are posing, to be able to try to answer some of them, to be able to try to work some of them through. So I think it's actually been a little bit later in my professor career. I've been at this for like about 10 years or something where I've been like, oh, okay, these could actually be the same thing. So right now, the second book I'm writing is actually it's about the debt collective, but it's not a backward looking book. It's not like, oh, this is what we've done. It's much more of a forward looking book about what I was just talking to you about like everybody knows what a workers union is, but folks don't know what a debtors union is. What is it? What could it be? How should it follow labor union models? How should it depart from them like that? So now I think my organizing life and my research life are much more connected than they were when I first started.
Yeah, I think that's great too. I mean, I feel like the way that you are able to connect the two, and I feel like a lot of that has to do with also, just passion, and probably helps a lot with deterring you from burnout per se, which obviously could probably still happen. But at the same time, I feel like if you love what you're doing in both sectors, um, you know, should be able to succeed as you have. Um, so that's great. I think to round out this conversation, just to leave it on a more broader note, just kind of if you have any general advice for any you know, anyone a part of the younger generations that is interested in organizing and social movements, just kind of any general advice you could give to them.
Absolutely. Go find one. Go find a social movement, and I don't mean on social media, and plug in, right? And what does plug in mean? Okay, well, you're college students and you're super busy, but obviously, Professor Turner's class, for example, gives you an opportunity to actually engage in something. Like you told me that you went to the debt collectives, to one of the 100 days to build debtor power, right? You can go to any one of social movements that you may find online. You can go to any one of their websites, any one of their social media channels. If they're a good social movement, they will give you an idea of how to plug in. This is when we have meetings and this is where they are, right? They're in your neighborhood at this time, or they're on Zoom and they're held at this time. These are, right? Any good social movement worth its salt has its ladder of engagement and has ways to get you involved, get folks involved. I think that all of us, I know it's true of your generation, but it was true of mine too. We talked about this a little bit at the beginning of the conversation. In some ways, we're taught, maybe not explicitly, but to be like a little cynical and to be
Mm.
like, oh, that movement isn't perfect enough. It's not radical enough for me, or it's not about this, or it's not about that. And therefore, I'm just going to like, scroll past it. But the thing is, if you want the world to change in a certain way, you sitting back and critiquing things that you think aren't radical enough or that you think don't do exactly what you would do or in that situation, it's not going to help anything, right? What is going to help is each of us saying, I refuse to see undocumented people deported. And therefore, I am going to look for the organizations or on the ground that are doing the frontline work, right? Whether they're doing work of legal mutual aid, whether they're doing work of teaching know your rights trainings, whether they're doing translation work, and I speak Spanish and English, and therefore I'm going to go, right? Like find one and plug in. And don't plug in as a cynic. Don't plug in as a, oh, I'm a so smart PhD student, or oh, I'm a so smart college student and I have something to offer. Plug in as somebody who wants to learn. And I can say from my own experience, but I know so many people for whom this has happened, becoming a meaningful part of social movements absolutely changed the course of my life. And it is probably the most important thing that I have ever done. And, but you have to commit yourself to it. It's lots of meetings, it's lots of note taking. You can burn out, right? All of that is real, but you have to commit yourself to it. And that's what I would say to anybody. Go out there and find something to commit yourself to and persist.
I think all that advice is very reassuring because I do think I would have to agree with you that, I feel like cynicism is something that's could be very prevalent in these realms because, people just want to see change happen overnight, which, as you know, is not the case. So yeah, I totally agree. And I think that just about covers everything that I think we wanted to talk about. So once again, I just want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to come meet with me and answer these questions. I'll be sure to link the Debt Collective's website down in the description of this video. And with that being said, yeah, just thank you again, Dr. Appeal. And I am Lucas Pichardo. I'm with UCLA Radio. Thank you for tuning into this interview.
Thanks so much, Lucas. Take care, everybody.
Of course.